In January of 1995, I moved from North Carolina to Chattanooga to begin serving on the pastoral staff of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in downtown Chattanooga. When I got there, there was another priest on staff named Ray Cash, K-A-S-C-H. And Ray and I had a very easy collegial rapport with one another and worked very well together until he moved on to another parish. It's Ray Cash who told me this story. Ray had known a friend in their youth whose mother used to say to the friend every time he left the house, "Remember who you are." Some great parenting. Remember who you are. Every time the young man left the house, he was reminded, remember who you are. Our names are important to us. My parents named me Joel. My father's name is Joe. They named me Joel. There's a Hebrew prophet in the Old Testament named Joel, and the word in Hebrew means "my God is the Lord." So I don't know how many times in my life I've introduced myself as Joel, and the person shakes my hand and smiles big and says, "Nice to meet you, Joe." And so I very politely, but firmly, tell him, "My name is Joel." More inexplicable is how many times I've introduced myself as Joel and somebody grabs my hand and shakes it and smiles and says, "Good to meet you, Jeff." That one really is a little harder to explain. Jeff and Joel don't really sound all that much alike. Our names are important to us. My name is important to me. Your name is important to you. And our name is important to us. St. Luke's. The man who wrote the Gospel of Luke also wrote the book of Acts. And so Luke and Acts are companion volumes in the New Testament. Everything in the Gospel of Luke anticipates what's coming in Acts, and everything in Acts reflects back on what has been talked about in the Gospel of Luke. And even though in the chronology of the New Testament, John sits right in the middle between Luke and Acts are clearly companion volumes and should be read in concert with each other. So the Gospel of Luke has 24 chapters in it, and the book of Acts has 28 chapters. And when you put Luke and Acts together as companion volumes, that makes Luke, the author, the single biggest contributor to the New Testament. We may instinctively think that Paul wrote more of the New Testament, but when you put Luke and Acts together, Luke is the single largest contributor to the New Testament. Remember who you are. We are St. Luke's. We associate ourselves with the largest single contributor to the New Testament. The New Testament tells us that Luke was a travel companion of Paul and that he was an associate with Paul in ministry. Philemon, verse 24, tells us that Luke was a fellow worker with Paul, so he clearly was more than a travel companion. Luke clearly was an associate of Paul's in ministry. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, we read Luke referred to as the beloved physician. And this is where our tradition comes from, that Luke was a doctor in his time. The third reference to Luke in the New Testament is in today's epistle lesson, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. When from prison, Paul writes to Timothy, "Only Luke is with me." Paul, of course, had other ministry associates. The passage from 2 Timothy today names several of Paul's other associates in ministry. But at this point in time, when Paul writes to Timothy from prison, it's only Luke who is there to visit him, to pray with him during visits, to comfort Paul while he is unjustly held for his faith. I just ask us today to think just for a moment of the gravity of what Paul says to Timothy. Of all of his ministry associates, at that point in time, Paul says, only Luke is with me. Let's please for a moment ponder the faithfulness that Luke showed in his association with Paul. And for a moment, let's please ponder the loyalty that Luke showed to Paul in Paul's greatest hour of need. And I simply ask us to ponder for a moment this morning. May we please consider what an honor it is to call ourselves St. Luke's. And may we please consider on today of all days the responsibility that comes with associating ourselves with St. Luke, a ministry associate of St. Paul. It's an honor to remember who we are at St. Luke's Episcopal Church. But back to today's epistle lesson, 2 Timothy 4, verses 5 through 13. In verse 5, Paul writes to Timothy, "As for you, always be sober, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, carry out your ministry fully." And then of himself, Paul writes in verses 6 through 7, "As for me, I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." Death is looming for Paul as he sits in prison. Paul can see that his martyrdom is on the near horizon. In the letter to Timothy, we call 2 Timothy, Paul is passing the baton to Timothy, his younger protege in ministry. Think for a moment of the gravity of this situation. Paul thinks his life is very near its end, that the time of his departure is very near. He writes Timothy to pass the torch on to his younger protege. And in passing the torch, he says, "Here where I am, only Luke is with me." Remember who you are. We are St. Luke's. Just this past Friday morning, there was a ribbon cutting here in the churchyard. We were celebrating the successful completion of the repointing project. Every single brick has been touched up through this very laborious, carefully carried out process. The work came to a successful conclusion several months ago, and we had a joint event with the chamber Friday morning to celebrate the completion of this very important renovation project. A couple of things were going on Friday morning. First of all, we did honor the history of this church represented by this historic building. We honored every single person on whose shoulders we stand as the modern day incarnation of St. Luke's. We are here because of those who came before us. We honored the people who made this church what it is and have left it to us to carry forward the ministry of Christ. We celebrated Friday morning that prayer has been valid in this historic church structure for over 150 years. But we did more than that Friday morning. We celebrated the present, the current life of this church. and we anticipated the future. This big renovation project we undertook was for our children and their children and their children. We honor the history of this parish. We honor those whom we love but see no longer. But we also honor this moment and the ministries to which we're called in the moment that is now. In thinking about this sermon for St. Luke's Day, my mind wandered back to Easter Sunday in 2020. I did not expect that to happen when I sat down to write this sermon, but my mind just went back to Easter 2020. The pandemic was full on by then. And on Easter Sunday morning in 2020, we did have church in this room, but there were 4 or 5 of us in here, and we were 10 to 15 feet apart from one another. But we did proclaim that Christ is risen, and we knew, even on that strange day, that the Lord was with us, and that one day we would be able to gather as a congregation again. But it was a very different Sunday, and during the liturgy itself, in real time, I thought our founders could not have imagined that in the future, on Easter Sunday, the church would intentionally be left vacant. It was an incongruous moment to think that on Easter Day, we've intentionally asked people not to be present in person. But we did worship with the Book of Common Prayer, and after the service, we did process, like we do every Easter Sunday morning, to the mausoleum. It was just 4 or 5 of us, but we maintained the tradition. And all of this was being live streamed, that new innovation that we had gone to in the pandemic. When we made our way out to the mausoleum, it was eerily quiet that morning. On Easter Day, there was no traffic on the streets. None of our sister churches were having service at this hour. It was also eerie to look up at the sky that morning. There was a lot going on in the atmosphere, and if you may remember, Easter Sunday night 2020 is when we had an outbreak of tornadoes. It was a surreal experience, having had Easter service in a room with basically no people. It was eerie to be at the mausoleum without the sound of children laughing and running and playing with one another, celebrating Easter. But all the while I knew this is the one-off. We will get back together. But it was eerie, it was strange how quiet it was. Here's the point I'm building toward. After the service, which was in accord with our tradition, I made my way to my office, and on that antiquated computer with which I'm perfectly happy and do not want a new one, on that antiquated old computer in my office, I dialed up our online service. And then I began to notice the views, the number of views just started climbing and climbing and climbing. The church had been empty, but the people were with us. And I began to see the names. People near and dear to all of us here in Cleveland, people from Bradley County and the surrounding area. Just dozens and dozens of people started showing up online. I thought, there's the church, there's the congregation. And then I saw somebody in New York City had worshiped with us on Easter Day in 2020. I suspect you may be with us right now. Hello. Hi. And then I noticed a person in Boise, Idaho had been with us during the Easter service. And then more than one person from Nashville began to appear, their names on the screen. And then a couple in Yorkshire, England said, "Happy Easter" from Yorkshire. And then I noticed people in Liberia were worshiping with us on Easter Day. And as I sat in front of that computer screen, I thought to myself, welcome to the church of the future. We will get back in person. We will restore in-person fellowship. But going forward, I realized even in the moment, there are no longer any geographical boundaries to whom this parish can serve. Anywhere in the world now, anybody with a computer connection can hear the gospel proclaimed through the worship life of St. Luke's in Cleveland, Tennessee. Since those fateful days early in the pandemic, we've built a Facebook following of over 3,000 people. And every week, a couple of hundred people at least worship with us online, in addition to the people who have been with us in person. Our founders could not have imagined that one day from this very sacred space, the gospel of Jesus Christ could be proclaimed not just to this local community, but to the four corners of the globe. We are on the receiving end of a rich heritage, but now it's our time to carry forward the work that this church was founded to undertake over 150 years ago. I conclude with this. 2,000 years ago, Paul passed the baton to Timothy. And in time, Timothy passed the baton to Luke. Luke is only mentioned 3 times in the New Testament by name. And yet he went on to become the single largest contributor to the New Testament. From Paul to Timothy to Luke to us. 2,000 years later, it's our time to know Christ and to make his love known. I finish with an alternate translation of 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 5. We heard it read a moment ago from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Here's the translation of 2 Timothy 4, verse 5, in the translation known as the Message. 2,000 years ago, Paul was writing to Timothy, but today the words come to us. But you, keep your eye on what you're doing. Accept the hard times along with the good. Keep the message alive. Do a thorough job as God's servant. Amen.